Hello, in the 27th Annual Civil War on the Border series. This year, as you probably know, we have a theme of exploring how the natural world and landscapes influenced events during the Civil War era. This is a field that historians are really starting to mine with a lot of great insights over the past decade or so. So with that in mind, we've asked Dr. Lisa Brady to speak with us today. Lisa is a professor of history at Boise State University and author of War Upon the Land, Military Strategy and the Transformation of Southern Landscapes During the American Civil War. And last but not least, Lisa is a fellow Jayhawk. So thanks for joining us today, Lisa.
Thank you, Will. I'm really excited to be here and to have this conversation with you.
Likewise. So let's talk about your book. In recent decades, as I already mentioned, scholars of the Civil War have started paying greater attention to environmental factors. So what inspired you to research and write War Upon the Land?
So when I began research for my book, which is a revised version of my dissertation written there in wonderful Lawrence, there was nothing out there on environmental history and the war, or any war, really. Environmental history was still a fairly new field. Military history, of course, has been around for thousands of years, but the two really hadn't quite met. And so I was in a 19th century colloquium with Phil Paladin, who many of your listeners may know as an amazing Civil War historian and fellow Jayhawk professor there for a while. And I was talking with him about how I might be able to merge my interest in the American Civil War, which had long been of interest to me since I was a little kid, and my expertise in environmental history. And he said, well, you're going to write something about it. That's how you do it. And so I did. I started off asking big questions about, how would environmental history inform military history? They already talk about terrain and weather and climate and all of these other things. How can environmental history bring new insight into a field that is really very well studied? And so it was really fun to be sort of at the forefront, digging out some of the earliest bits and pieces of environmental history of the Civil War. But it was really, to get to your actual question of what inspired me, it was the novelty of it, the excitement of being able to sort of open new fields of study, and to really merge my passion in environmental history and my fascination with the American Civil War. And it's so gratifying and so fun to see all of the scholarship that has come out since my dissertation and my book. Other people were working on it at the same time. I'm not saying that it's all out of my book, but mine was one of the earliest ones. And it's just wonderful to see how much the field has grown since then.
Yeah, as I already mentioned, it's a really exciting topic in the Civil War field. So we've talked a little bit about the scholarship. So I've always wondered this myself. So how did Americans view the natural world and their landscapes of the North American continent when the war broke out in 1861?
That's a huge question. And the answer that my students always hate when I give is, it depends. If we're going to look at it sort of from a broad generalization, the sort of prevailing view of nature in the United States at the time of the secession conflict and of the war itself was that nature was there to be used, that there were resources out there that could improve people's lives, that could build all the things that they wanted. Industrialization had really begun to develop in the United States, primarily in the North, but of course in the South as well, right? There were ironworks and mines and all of that in the South. And so the natural world was seen as a repository of resources that could improve people's lives, make them profits, make their lives easier. There were, of course, a number of groups and individuals who saw nature very differently. Native American groups, of course, had a very different approach to nature than sort of general white society. Enslaved African Americans, of course, also experienced nature very differently than their white counterparts in the South and in the North. And then there were those who started to see by the early 19th century, and sort of it had matured by the mid 19th century, a sense that nature needed to be something more, that it was inherently something more than just a resource, than just a source for profit or comfort, that it in itself had value. And these are the folks like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, and George Perkins Marsh. They're sort of the most famous advocates for the preservation, protection, conservation of nature in the antebellum world, or the antebellum nation, I should say. And so it's sort of a complex approach to the natural world, but the dominant one is the one where nature is there to be used, nature is there to support our lives. And that's really the view that takes shape and sort of dominates the Civil War era, those years of conflict as well.
Very interesting. So, Lisa, I have to apologize. It probably won't surprise people that we went over these questions ahead of time, but if you'll pardon, feel free to not spend a huge amount of time addressing this. But it just occurred to me, was there a biblical or a Christian element to the idea that nature is there for mankind to use?
Absolutely. There are a number of scholars who've written on this particular issue. And I learned in my very first environmental history class sort of the origins of both dominion over nature and stewardship of nature within the passages of Genesis. And those were concepts that the Christian God had set out nature to support humans, and humans as the top of the food chain. That, of course, is not how it's said in Genesis, but as sort of the dominant species, had nature there to support them, right? And they were to exert dominion over it. But with dominion also came a sense of responsibility, right? You had power, but responsibility. It's like Spider-Man, I guess, right? There's, and that's where the stewardship comes in, where you've got a sense of, yes, you may have power over nature and the species and the creatures of nature, but you also have a responsibility to protect it, to conserve it, to use it wisely. And so those are two both competing and complementary ideas that come out of Christian teachings that scholars of religion and of the environment have certainly applied to understanding American approaches to the natural world through the 19th century for sure, and even into the 20th and 21st centuries.
Excellent. Very interesting. So let's get into what happened once the war broke out. Of course, those who study the Civil War or have read about it know that, the United States military had to go in and invade and conquer this vast swath of territory in the 11 states that seceded, plus the border states in many cases as well. So I'm wondering, did the Confederacy and the Confederate forces and government depend upon the physical features of the South in formulating a defense? And how else did the natural world contribute to the Confederate war effort?
Yeah, that is also a really fascinating question. And that was one of the elements of my research that sort of really got me into it in the first place, right? Was how did both the Union forces and the Confederate forces use nature to their advantage? Now, both armies, they were trained at West Point. The vast majority of Civil War generals who had prior military experience had been trained at West Point. They were trained as engineers, topographical engineers, other types of engineers, and so they saw nature through a utilitarian lens. They were also trained in Napoleonic military doctrine. And so both of them were fighting under the assumptions that you had to use the lay of the land, the terrain, the landscape itself to your military advantage. So, the army with the high ground is going to have a great advantage, right? That's sort of one of the adages that not just Napoleonic doctrine, but all military doctrine sort of espouses. But also in this period, having your flank along a river was a secure position, or against a dense forest, or some other type of geographical feature that was not easily overcome by the opposing forces, right? Mm-hmm. So there was the terrain aspect of it. But what I found even more interesting was how the two forces, the Union and Confederate forces, looked to the human managed landscape as part of their, if not strategy, then their operational and tactical levels of warfare. And I would say that with a few notable exceptions, the Union did that more successfully than the Confederacy. So my colleague and friend, Mark Fiji, has written a wonderful article about the organic nature of the Gettysburg campaign from the perspective of Robert E. Lee and the Confederate forces, that they were trying to draw the Union forces away from the South, which had already been really heavily damaged, if not in some places destroyed, by the prolonged fighting in that region, especially Northern Virginia. Mm-hmm. And so Fiji argues that Lee intentionally drew the Union north to sort of give that territory some reprieve, but also to bring some of the devastation and destruction to northern states, mm-hmm. as well as use the resources of the North to their advantage, basically to get food, to get shoes, to get cloth for uniforms and other supplies. So there's a lot of different ways that the South sort of took advantage of their home territory, right? Because most of the war was fought in Confederate territory. And the Southerners knew their landscape really, really well, and they used it to great advantage. But by about 1865, it turned against them in some ways. I'm not saying that nature has intent. I'm just saying that the balance of power, the natural balance of power, shifted toward the Union side when the Union, primarily under Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan, sort of attacked the natural landscape, attacked the Southern landscape, both built and natural, as part of their strategy. There's a second part to your question, and if you'll allow me to sort of keep going, it's how did nature in the South serve the Confederacy? One, it's an incredibly productive region, right? And so the agricultural produce could have and should have gone to support the Confederate troops. Had they turned to corn, to wheat, well, less so wheat, but to food products, they might have had a better advantage, but they kept their lands in sugarcane and tobacco and cotton because it seemed to be more profitable and productive, right? They thought they could sell it, get the guns and the ammunition and the supplies they needed, but that isn't really, that didn't work out very well for them. But the other ways that the landscape supported the Confederate cause was through disease, was through because the northern troops, the Union troops would come down. They had not been exposed to many of the diseases that were endemic to the South. And that was a huge cause of mortality and morbidity for the Union forces. So many Union troops were laid low and made ineffective by malaria, by yellow fever, by other diseases in the South. Another way is just through the verdancy of the South, the lush vegetation that made it extremely difficult to move armies, especially the size of the armies that the Union was deploying across the landscape. I could go on and on about this. swamps, snakes, alligators, mosquitoes, all of these critters that in the newspapers at the time, Southerners were saying, we're not even going to have to fight the Union troops because our gators are going to get them, or they're going to fall at the, by the swords of the mosquitoes, right? These wonderful sort of descriptions of nature being an ally of the Confederate cause.
That's fascinating. And yeah, I've read some of those really confident claims in the Confederate newspapers too,
Yeah.
particularly the ones down in Louisiana where they counted on Yellow Jack,
Yeah.
yellow fever to decimate the Yankees.
Yeah.
Um, so getting back toward the Union side of the war, or United States side of the war, uh, since about, I think it was 1995 or so when a pretty important book came out. Some Civil War scholars have characterized Union military policy toward the South as hard war. It wasn't total war, but it was hard war, and it got harder as the war went on. So you mentioned earlier how some Union commanders attacked the landscape in attacking the Confederates, and how did these southern landscapes factor into Union commanders' plans to subdue the rebellious South? And I feel free to give some detail on some of the examples that you cite in your book, and also how successful were they in doing these operations?
So you've hit right at the crux of my argument, and this is what I think was the most fascinating part of my research, was seeing how Northern commanders started seeing the Southern landscape in a very different way, right? They'd seen it as engineers. They saw it as a puzzle to be solved, an obstacle to be overcome. And that certainly was the approach that Grant and others, Williams, I forgot the commander's name just before Grant, who was down in Louisiana, they saw the Mississippi River as an obstacle to be overcome. So particularly at Vicksburg, right? Vicksburg, if you've ever been there, it sits high on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River. Well, it used to. In 1863, it did. The river has since changed, which is one of those wonderful ironies of history. And so Vicksburg was this impenetrable fortress, right? They had the high ground. It was the Napoleonic sweet spot. They had cannon up over the bluffs, all along the Mississippi River. And so the Brown Water Navy, the river navy of the United States, could not get past Vicksburg, whether coming from the south. New Orleans and Baton Rouge fell fairly early. The north, of course, the Unions were coming down from the south, or from the north, sorry, coming south from the north. And Vicksburg was the sticking point. They just couldn't dislodge the Confederacy from Vicksburg. And so their solution was not a military solution, it was an engineering solution. They decided, Williams first and then Grant decided, that they would just simply cut off the oxbow, or the sort of the loop of the Mississippi River that ran by Vicksburg. And so if you can sort of picture, there's the river coming down, and then it goes like this, and here's Vicksburg, and it goes here. And so the Union decided to just cut off that upper loop and bypass Vicksburg and make it irrelevant. Well, it didn't work. They tried and they tried and they tried. First, there was not enough water. Then there was too much water. They just couldn't get it to work. And so that engineering approach to military victory taught Grant a very valuable lesson. He decided that he couldn't control nature, right? He was not going to be able to manipulate nature to his benefit. But what he could do was take that control away from the Southern populace. And therefore, they could not support the Confederate cause. And this is, of course, the main argument of my book, right? That under Grant's initial leadership in Mississippi, Louisiana, and the siege of Vicksburg, and basically the raids that his lieutenants went out and did in the Mississippi countryside, taught him a very valuable lesson about removing a sense of control by Southern civilians over their landscape, and therefore denying Confederate forces their support. This was then applied in a much larger scale in two other places, the Shenandoah Valley, first under Hunter and then under Sheridan, who was ruthless in his basically raising of the Shenandoah Valley, which was such an important place or storehouse really for the Confederacy. And then, of course, probably the most famous one is Sherman's March to the Sea. The effects of Sherman's March have been somewhat exaggerated with time, but that I think is actually less important. The facts of the matter, how much he destroyed, how much he sort of incorporated into Union storehouses, the damage that he caused, the actual damage I think is less important than the psychological aspect of it. And this is where we come down to the hard war, right? Taking the war to the civilians, making them feel, in Sherman's word, the hard hand of war, and denying them security and, again, as I argue, control over nature. They were farmers, they were industrialists, some of them, and he denied them their power to make nature support them, their power to sort of transform their landscape into something that they could use, whether for their own use or for the Confederacy. And so that psychological aspect of it, the denying Southerners their control over their landscape, was a fatal blow to the Confederate cause and was, I would argue, one of the most important aspects of Union victory under Grant's ultimate leadership in the last couple of years of the war.
That's fascinating, and it really, shows evidence of this being the first modern war, which is kind of an old concept, of course. But like, I remember, maybe you can tell me if this is true or not, that Sherman, before he starts out on the Atlanta campaign, he really seriously pores over like the census returns for Georgia, and he's looking at where the factories are and where the rivers run. And of course, as a younger officer, he'd been stationed in that area, so he knew that area fairly well. So it strikes me that this is these generals on the Union side are employing like what seem to be modern concepts of really knowing the lay of the land and knowing your enemy and where their resources are, striking at the heart of those resources.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. And the interesting thing about Sherman is he was also stationed in Louisiana, and he really loved the South. He would have stayed in the South had he not been called up to war. But he just could not abide by what he saw as treason, right? Of complete abrogation of the Constitution. And so for him, the secession of the South and he felt zero compunction against taking the war to the Southern civilians. He saw that as they made a choice, he made a choice, they made the wrong choice, and they're going to pay for it. Yeah. So he had, as you said, a great deal of knowledge about the landscape all throughout the South, but particularly Louisiana and Georgia. And he, it was a place that he loved, actually. Mm-hmm. He just thought the people were really wrong in their decision making.
Yeah. And perhaps it's a good idea at this point to acknowledge that it wasn't a total war, as I mentioned before. That I mentioned that these commanders were forward thinking in their strategies, in tactics, but they weren't like deliberately targeting civilians as combatants who could be violently attacked, as we saw in like the World Wars, that kind of thing, particularly World War II. So there is still a distinction to be made there.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point, and I'm glad you raised that, because that is definitely one of the misconceptions, I think, right. In particular, Sherman in Georgia and Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley, that they were sort of willy-nilly killing civilians, and in fact, that was absolutely against both of their orders, and they dealt with soldiers who went against those orders very harshly. Summary execution in some instances.
Right. So we've talked about how this attack on the land, these attacks on the landscape, really were a factor in it, helping the United States subdue the Confederacy. So 1865, the war ends, although, of course, scholars are starting to argue that the war didn't actually end in 1865. But did Americans emerge from, that traditional ending point of the Civil War, the mid 1860s, with different relationships toward nature than they had before the war?
I think so, and my research I think bears that out. It's one of the things that I noticed in so many letters and diaries, and even some of the newspaper accounts and more public, writing for more public consumption, was this sense of wilderness, right? That one of the things that the war was creating was these pockets of wilderness. And in the 19th century, certainly prior to the war and throughout the war, wilderness was a bad thing, right? Wilderness was a place of danger. It was a place of lack of knowledge, right? The unfamiliar places. It was a lack of human control. And so when Sherman vowed to make the South howl, right, he's alluding to the wolves of the wilderness, and alluding to early American writing about the howling wilderness. I believe that was Bradshaw who wrote about the howling wilderness in the colonial period. And so you've got this sense of wilderness as being a dangerous place to be avoided, to be conquered, to be eliminated. And what you start to see is that the devastation of the war, the destruction, the deprivation that the war is causing, makes people look to the natural world as a place of security, a place of beauty, a place of solace, perhaps even of salvation. And so there were increasing efforts to protect the wilderness, to protect natural places, to sort of conserve and put outside of human exploitation, the reach of human exploitation, places that might bring some solace to the war-torn nation. And so it was in 1864 that Lincoln signed the bill that set aside what is today Yosemite National Park. It was originally a state park, but Frederick Law Olmsted, who I'm sure are well familiar with, headed up the effort in California to set aside the sequoia groves and the park as a place to keep separate from human management, I guess is the best word, but a place where people can go and heal, right? It was seen also as a place of healing. And I think it's important that it happens in 1864, that you've got this massive war going on, huge amounts of loss of life, devastation, visible devastation everywhere. And yet here's this place that people go to or can even just think about, knowing that it's out there, was important to them. And so that it became national law, that the national park system got going under Grant is, I think, no accident. And so there was a shift in the ways that people thought about nature, and particular wild nature, as, a place of redemption, even, I would say.
That's fascinating. So, yes, Lisa, thank you very much for taking the time today to lend us your expertise about this amazing topic. And I have to say, I really admire you for getting all these ideas into a relatively thin work. So, yeah. All right. Well,
yeah, it's not a big book.
no, it's not, but you really pack a lot of ideas into your work. So, speaking of that book, for those of you who want to read more about these topics, yes, pick up Lisa Brady's book, War Upon the Land, Military Strategy and the Transformation of Southern Landscapes During the American Civil War. So again, thank you, Lisa, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Of course. And I want to say thanks to everyone in the audience that joined us. And I also want to thank Lawrence Parks and Recreation Department for sponsoring Civil War on the Border. And with that, I'll say bye for now.